telegraph operator who received messages from the dead, San Francisco's phantom wires, 1906. Thomas McKinnon pressed the telegraph key at precisely 11:47 p.m., sending the final emergency dispatch of his shift into San Francisco's devastated electrical grid. But as he reached for his coat, the key began clicking on its own, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash, dash, spelling out a message that defied every law of physics and death. The transmission claimed to be from Station 7, the telegraph office that had been crushed under a collapsed building 3 days earlier during the Great San Francisco earthquake. According to city records, Station 7 and its operator, William Chen, were both dead. Yet the message tapping through Thomas's equipment was perfectly clear. "This is Chen at Station 7. I have accumulated 43 undelivered messages since the earthquake. Families are waiting for word from their loved ones. Please acknowledge and assist with transmission." Thomas had worked the graveyard shift at Montgomery Street Telegraph Office for 8 years, and he could identify every operator in the Bay Area network by their key technique alone. William Chen's transmission style was unmistakable, minash, rapid, efficient, with a characteristic triple-tap signature that made his messages instantly recognizable to anyone who had worked the San Francisco circuit. But William Chen had died on April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., when the massive earthquake brought down the 3-story brick building that housed Station 7. Thomas had helped carry Chen's body from the rubble himself. The Great San Francisco earthquake had obliterated the city's communication infrastructure. Of the 22 telegraph stations operating before dawn on April 18, only 7 remained functional. The Western Union and Pacific Telegraph companies were working around the clock to restore emergency communications, but the damage was so catastrophic that normal service wouldn't resume for months. Every surviving operator in the Bay Area was pulling 18-hour shifts, handling desperate messages from survivors trying to contact family members across the country. Thomas stared at his telegraph key as it continued its impossible transmission. The signal was coming through on the frequency assigned to Station 7, using Chen's personal call sign, W7SC, and following standard protocol for routine message traffic. Everything about the transmission was procedurally correct, except that it originated from a man who had been buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery 2 days earlier, operating equipment that had been reduced to twisted metal and broken wire. Against his training and better judgment, Thomas placed his trembling hand on the key and tapped out a response. "This is Montgomery Station, Operator McKinnon. Station 7 was destroyed in earthquake. Operator Chen confirmed, deceased. Please identify actual location and transmitting operator." The response came immediately, in Chen's unmistakable rhythm. "Thomas, this is William Chen, operating from Station 7. I understand there was significant structural damage, but my equipment remains functional. I've been maintaining emergency communications since 5:12 a.m. on April 18th. Why haven't you been acknowledging my transmissions? I have urgent messages from earthquake victims." The hair on Thomas's arms stood up as he recognized not just Chen's transmission technique, but intimate details that only the real William Chen would know. The message referenced Thomas by his first name, mentioned specific conversations they had shared during previous shifts, and demonstrated knowledge of internal company procedures that wouldn't be available to someone impersonating a telegraph operator. But more disturbing than the personal details was the reference to 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, the exact moment when the earthquake had struck San Francisco, and according to Thomas's own witness, the precise time when William Chen had died. Over the following nights, the impossible communications continued. Chen's phantom transmissions arrived every evening between 11:30 p.m. and dawn, always following proper telegraph protocols, always containing messages supposedly from earthquake survivors trying to contact relatives in other cities. The content of these messages was heartbreaking. Thomas had tells people trapped in collapsed buildings, calling for help, families separated by the disaster, trying to locate missing members, survivors providing updates on their condition and whereabouts. Thomas began keeping detailed records of Chen's phantom transmissions, documenting the time, content, and technical characteristics of each message. What disturbed him most was that many of the messages contained information that proved to be accurate. When Chen relayed a message from someone claiming to be trapped in the basement of the Felon building, rescue workers found exactly that person in exactly that location. When he transmitted coordinates for a family of survivors hiding in Golden Gate Park, relief workers found them precisely where Chen's phantom messages indicated they would be. But there was something else about Chen's messages that made Thomas's blood run cold. Many of the people sending messages through Chen's phantom station had names that appeared on the official casualty lists from the earthquake. According to city records, these people had died in the disaster, yet their messages, transmitted through a dead operator using destroyed equipment, contained current information about ongoing rescue efforts and the location of living survivors. Before I continue with what Thomas discovered about the true nature of these phantom transmissions, I need to know that you're ready for this revelation. If you've ever felt a connection to someone after they passed away, or if you've experienced something that couldn't be explained by normal means, right, I hear the voices in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Thomas learned about the boundary between life and death will change everything you thought you knew about communication with the departed. Thomas's investigation into the phantom transmissions led him to Laurel Hill Cemetery, where he visited William Chen's grave on the night of April 23rd, exactly 5 days after the earthquake. Armed with a portable telegraph key and battery pack, Thomas set up his equipment beside Chen's headstone and attempted direct communication with his deceased colleague. At 11:47 p.m., the same time when phantom transmissions usually began, Thomas tapped out a message. "Chen, this is McKinnon. If you can receive this, please explain what happened to you and how you are still transmitting." The response didn't come through Thomas's portable equipment. Instead, it manifested as a series of soft tapping sounds on Chen's wooden grave marker. ... mice, spelling out a message that explained everything and nothing. "Thomas, I am not transmitting from Station 7. I am transmitting from where Station 7 used to be. The earthquake didn't just destroy buildings and kill people. It created a crack between the world of the living and the world of the dead. I am operating the phantom telegraph network for people who died but don't know they're dead yet." This revelation led Thomas to understand that the Great San Francisco earthquake had been more than a natural disaster. It had been a catastrophic disruption of the boundary between life and death. The massive geological forces unleashed on April 18th had created what Chen described as communication channels that allowed consciousness to persist after physical death, particularly in locations where people had been engaged in communication work at the moment of their death. Chen's phantom messages revealed that dozens of earthquake victims had died while in the process of sending telegraph messages, making telephone calls, or writing letters. The sudden violent nature of their deaths had left their consciousness suspended in a state between life and death, still trying to complete their interrupted communications. Chen, who had died while operating his telegraph key, had somehow become the coordinator for this network of phantom communicators, helping other deceased victims complete the messages they had been trying to send when the earthquake killed them. But the most disturbing aspect of Chen's phantom telegraph network was that it wasn't limited to earthquake victims. Thomas learned that the disruption caused by the earthquake had created a permanent communication channel between San Francisco and what Chen called the other side. Dead people from throughout the city's history could now access the phantom network, sending messages through Chen's impossible telegraph station to living relatives and friends. The content of these messages ranged from heartbreaking to terrifying. Some were simple expressions of love from deceased family members wanting to comfort living relatives. Others were warnings about dangers that only the dead could perceive. Mice, predictions of aftershocks, locations of hidden fires, and the names of people who would die in subsequent disasters if they didn't respond. But there was a darker element to the phantom network that Chen reluctantly revealed to Thomas during their graveyard communications. Some of the entities accessing the phantom telegraph system weren't recently deceased earthquake victims or loving family members. They were malevolent consciousness that had been imprisoned in San Francisco's soil for decades, held in check by the city's normal geological stability. The earthquake had released them, and they were using Chen's phantom network to influence living people, sending messages designed to manipulate, corrupt, and destroy the lives of San Francisco residents. Thomas faced a moral dilemma that had no precedent in human history. The phantom telegraph network was providing genuine comfort to grieving families and vital information that was saving lives during the ongoing earthquake recovery efforts, but it was also serving as a conduit for malevolent entities that sought to harm the living. Thomas had to decide whether to continue facilitating communication with the dead, knowing that he might be enabling forces that threatened the spiritual and physical safety of his city. The decision became urgent when Chen's phantom transmissions began, including warnings about living people in San Francisco who had been marked for influence by the malevolent entities using the phantom network. These warnings identified specific individuals who were receiving phantom messages designed to drive them to madness, violence, or self-destruction. Chen's messages to Thomas became increasingly desperate, explaining that the phantom telegraph network was being overwhelmed by malevolent consciousness that were more powerful and cunning than the earthquake victims Chen was trying to help. Thomas began investigating the people Chen had warned about, visiting their homes and businesses to observe their behavior and look for signs that they were being influenced by phantom communications. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Several of the warned individuals had begun receiving phantom telephone calls, mysterious letters, and even direct telepathic communications from entities claiming to be deceased relatives or religious figures. These malevolent phantom communications were systematically designed to exploit the grief, guilt, and desperation that many San Francisco residents felt in the aftermath of the earthquake. The entities were impersonating dead family members to convince living people to make destructive decisions, selling their property for nothing, abandoning their families, or even committing suicide to join their loved ones in the phantom realm. But the most insidious aspect of the malevolent phantom communications was that they contained just enough accurate information to seem credible. The entities had access to the memories and knowledge of genuine earthquake victims, allowing them to impersonate dead relatives with convincing details about family history, personal relationships, and intimate knowledge that only the real deceased person would possess. Thomas realized that the phantom telegraph network had become a battleground between benevolent entities like William Chen, who were trying to help earthquake survivors, and malevolent consciousness that were exploiting the disaster to gain influence over the living. The outcome of this supernatural conflict would determine whether San Francisco recovered from the earthquake as a stronger community, or descended into chaos under the influence of entities that fed on human suffering and destruction. The turning point came when Chen's phantom transmissions revealed the location of what he called the primary breach, minus the specific geographical point where the earthquake had created the strongest connection between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This location wasn't at the epicenter of the earthquake, but rather at a specific building in San Francisco's Chinatown, where several telegraph operators, telephone operators, and postal workers had died simultaneously while handling communications. Chen explained that the malevolent entities were using this primary breach as their main access point to the phantom network, and that closing it would severely limit their ability to influence living people. But closing the breach would also sever the connection that allowed earthquake victims to communicate with their living families and friends. Thomas would have to choose between protecting San Francisco from supernatural predators and preserving the final opportunity for earthquake victims to say goodbye to their loved ones. The investigation into the primary breach led Thomas to discover that the building in question had a dark history that predated the 1906 earthquake by several decades. City records revealed that it had been built on the site of a mass grave, where victims of San Francisco's 1868 cholera epidemic had been buried without proper religious ceremonies. The hasty burial of hundreds of disease victims in unconsecrated ground had created what occult researchers would later identify as a spiritual wound in the fabric of reality. When the 1906 earthquake struck, the geological disruption had torn open this old spiritual wound, creating a permanent portal between the physical world and what Chen described as the hungry dark, a realm inhabited by consciousness that fed on human suffering and sought to inflict pain on living people. The malevolent entities Thomas was fighting weren't random evil spirits, but organized predators that had been waiting decades for an opportunity to access the world of the living. Chen's phantom transmissions included detailed technical instructions for closing the primary breach, but the procedure would require Thomas to physically enter the damaged building and perform a ritual that involved considerable personal risk. More troubling, the ritual would need to be completed during the peak hours of phantom network activity, between midnight and dawn, when the malevolent entities would be at their strongest and most aggressive. Thomas spent several days preparing for what he understood might be a suicide mission. He studied Chen's technical instructions, gathered the materials needed for the breach closing ritual, and wrote detailed letters to his family and the Pacific Telegraph Company, explaining his actions in case he didn't survive the confrontation with the entities controlling the phantom network. But on the night before his planned mission to close the primary breach, Thomas received a phantom transmission that changed everything about his understanding of the situation. The message wasn't from William Chen or any of the other earthquake victims he had been communicating with for weeks. It was from his own father, Patrick McKinnon, who had died of tuberculosis 3 years earlier. Patrick's phantom message revealed that Thomas himself had been selected by the malevolent entities as a target for possession. The weeks of communication with the phantom network had gradually opened Thomas's mind to supernatural influence, and the entities had been using his grief over his father's death to establish psychological control over his decisions and behavior. Thomas's plan to close the primary breach wasn't his own idea. It was a manipulation designed to deliver him directly to the entities that sought to possess his body and use his living status to extend their influence into the physical world. The revelation that his own father was communicating through the phantom network forced Thomas to confront the possibility that all of the phantom transmissions, even those from William Chen, might be manipulations created by malevolent entities impersonating dead people. The accurate information contained in many phantom messages could be explained by the entity's ability to access the memories of genuine deceased individuals, allowing them to impersonate the dead with perfect credibility. But Patrick McKinnon's phantom transmission included something that convinced Thomas of its authenticity: personal details about their relationship that no malevolent entity could have accessed through memory theft. His father revealed private conversations, shared jokes, and intimate family moments that had never been recorded or witnessed by anyone else. More importantly, Patrick's communication style perfectly matched his personality as Thomas remembered it, including speech patterns, favorite expressions, and characteristic ways of thinking about problems. Patrick's phantom message explained that the situation in San Francisco was more complex than either Thomas or William Chen had understood. The phantom telegraph network was indeed being used by malevolent entities, but it was also serving as a genuine communication channel for deceased individuals who wanted to protect their living relatives from supernatural predation. The network had become a battleground where benevolent and malevolent entities competed for influence over living people. The key to resolving the crisis wasn't closing the primary breach, but rather establishing proper spiritual protection that would allow beneficial phantom communications to continue while blocking access by malevolent entities. Patrick's message included detailed instructions for creating what he called sanctified communication protocols that would filter phantom transmissions based on the spiritual. These sanctified protocols required Thomas to work with representatives from San Francisco's various religious communities, Latheshes, Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis, Chinese Buddhist monks, and Native American spiritual leaders, to create blessed communication equipment that could distinguish between helpful and harmful phantom transmissions. The multi-faith approach was necessary because the malevolent entities were sophisticated enough to circumvent protections based on any single religious tradition. The implementation of sanctified communication protocols proved more challenging than Patrick McKinnon's phantom instructions had suggested. San Francisco's religious communities were deeply suspicious of any communication with the dead, viewing the phantom telegraph network as inherently evil regardless of the intentions of specific entities. Many religious leaders refused to participate in what they considered occult practices, even if the goal was protecting their congregations from supernatural predators. Thomas eventually found support from an unlikely coalition of religious progressives who understood that the 1906 earthquake had created unprecedented spiritual conditions that required innovative responses. Father Michael O'Brien from St. Mary's Cathedral, Rabbi Samuel Goldstein from Temple Emmanuel, and Reverend Chen Wei from the Buddhist Temple of San Francisco agreed to work together on blessing communication equipment that could serve as a filter for phantom transmissions. The process of creating sanctified communication protocols took several weeks and required extensive experimentation with different combinations of religious blessings, protective symbols, and technical modifications to telegraph equipment. The final system involved telegraph keys that had been blessed by multiple religious traditions, transmission wires that incorporated silver blessed in various ceremonies, and receiving equipment that had been inscribed with protective symbols from different spiritual traditions. When Thomas first used the sanctified communication equipment to contact the phantom network, the difference was immediately apparent. Genuine communications from deceased earthquake victims came through clearly and with consistent emotional warmth. Messages from malevolent entities attempting to impersonate dead relatives contained subtle distortions, inconsistencies, and an underlying coldness that the sanctified equipment made obvious to detect. More importantly, the sanctified protocols allowed Thomas to establish secure communication with William Chen and confirm that Chen's phantom transmissions had been genuine from the beginning. Chen revealed that he and other benevolent deceased individuals had been working to protect living San Francisco residents from malevolent entities, using the phantom telegraph network to send warnings, provide accurate information about dangers, and offer comfort to grieving families. But Chen also revealed that Thomas's investigation had attracted the attention of more powerful malevolent entities than those they had been dealing with previously. The success of the sanctified communication protocols had been noticed by what Chen described as the ancient hunger, consciousness that had been trapped beneath San Francisco for centuries, predating both the 1906 earthquake and the 1868 cholera epidemic. These ancient entities were far more sophisticated than the simple predators that had been exploiting the phantom network since the earthquake. They possessed knowledge of religious protection methods and were capable of circumventing even the multi-faith sanctified protocols that Thomas had developed. Worse yet, they had been using the weeks of phantom network activity to study the spiritual defenses of San Francisco's living population, identifying individuals and families who would be most vulnerable to supernatural influence. The ancient entity's plan was revealed through a series of phantom transmissions that Chen intercepted and decoded. They intended to possess key figures in San Francisco's government, business community, and religious leadership, using these influential people to gradually transform the city into what they called a feeding ground, a community where living people would unknowingly serve the interests of malevolent consciousness that fed on human suffering. The process would be gradual and subtle, implemented through phantom communications that would influence possessed leaders to make decisions that increased poverty, conflict, and despair among San Francisco's population. Over time, the city would become a source of spiritual nourishment for entities that grew stronger as human beings became more miserable, frightened, and hopeless. Thomas realized that his work with the Phantom Telegraph network had evolved from a simple investigation of unusual communications into a struggle for the spiritual future of San Francisco. The sanctified communication protocols he had developed were just the first step in what would need to be a comprehensive defense system protecting the city from supernatural predation that could continue for decades or centuries. Working with Chen and other benevolent entities through the sanctified Phantom Network, Thomas began developing what they called the Living Defense, a system that would train selected San Francisco residents to recognize and resist phantom communications from malevolent entities while maintaining beneficial contact with deceased relatives and friends who wanted to help protect the city. The Living Defense system required extensive training programs for volunteers who would serve as spiritual sentries, monitoring their communities for signs of supernatural influence, and providing support for individuals who were being targeted by malevolent phantom communications. These volunteers would be equipped with sanctified communication equipment and trained in the religious and psychological techniques needed to distinguish between helpful and harmful contact with the dead. But implementing the Living Defense system required Thomas to reveal the existence of the Phantom Network to San Francisco's city government, religious leadership, and business community. Many of the people who would need to support the defense system were the same individuals that the ancient entities had identified as priority targets for possession. Thomas would need to warn people about supernatural predators while simultaneously protecting them from those same predators during the warning process. The revelation of San Francisco's phantom communication network created unprecedented chaos in the city's recovery efforts following the 1906 earthquake. Religious leaders demanded the immediate destruction of all telegraph equipment that had been involved in phantom communications. Government officials wanted to suppress all information about the Phantom Network to prevent panic among the population. Business leaders worried that acknowledging supernatural activity would discourage investment in San Francisco's rebuilding efforts. But Thomas had evidence that proved the Phantom Network's existence and demonstrated both its benefits and dangers for the city's population. His detailed records of phantom communications included accurate predictions of aftershocks, precise locations of earthquake survivors, and information about hidden dangers that had saved dozens of lives during the recovery period. This practical value of phantom communications made it impossible for authorities to dismiss the phenomenon as delusion or fraud. The compromise solution that emerged from weeks of debate was the establishment of the San Francisco Spiritual Communications Commission, a quasi-official organization that would regulate and monitor contact with the Phantom Network while providing protection services for citizens who were being targeted by malevolent entities. Thomas was appointed as the commission's first director, with William Chen serving as the primary liaison with benevolent deceased individuals who wanted to help protect the city. The Spiritual Communications Commission operated for 15 years from 1906 to 1921, providing services that ranged from spiritual protection consultations to emergency communications during subsequent disasters. The Commission's sanctified telegraph equipment was used during the 1918 influenza pandemic to facilitate communication between dying patients and their families, and during the 1920 dock workers' strike to provide accurate information about labor conflicts that helped prevent violence. But the Commission's most important work involved training San Francisco residents to recognize and resist phantom communications from malevolent entities while maintaining beneficial relationships with deceased family members and friends. This training created a unique spiritual literacy among San Francisco's population that persisted for generations, making the city notably resistant to various forms of supernatural predation and occult manipulation. Thomas McKinnon continued working as director of the Spiritual Communications Commission until his death in 1934. His final phantom transmission sent through William Chen from the other side of death confirmed that the ancient entities beneath San Francisco remained active but contained by the spiritual defense systems he had helped establish. The Phantom Telegraph Network continued operating until 1954, when changes in communication technology finally severed the connection between the world of the living and the phantom realm. But the legacy of Thomas's work with the Phantom Network extended far beyond San Francisco's spiritual defense systems. His detailed documentation of communication with the dead provided evidence that consciousness could persist after physical death and maintain meaningful relationships with living people under certain circumstances. This evidence influenced religious thought, psychological research, and philosophical understanding of the nature of human identity for decades. Modern researchers studying Thomas McKinnon's records have found that many of the techniques developed for the sanctified communication protocols remain effective for protecting against contemporary forms of supernatural predation. The multi-faith approach to spiritual defense has been adopted by paranormal investigation teams, religious organizations, and even some government agencies dealing with unexplained phenomena. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Phantom Telegraph Network is that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than most people assume, and that this permeability creates both opportunities and dangers for living communities. Thomas's work demonstrated that contact with the dead can provide genuine comfort, protection, and practical assistance for the living, but only when proper spiritual safeguards are maintained. The story of San Francisco's Phantom Telegraph Network also revealed that major disasters can create lasting changes in the spiritual ecology of affected areas. The 1906 earthquake didn't just kill people and destroy buildings. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the living and the dead in San Francisco, creating conditions that persisted for decades and influenced the city's development in subtle but significant ways. If this story has made you more aware of the possibility that consciousness might persist after death and continue caring for living people, please share it with others who might find comfort in this idea. Subscribe for more historical cases where ordinary people encountered extraordinary evidence that life's boundaries are more flexible than we usually imagine. Before you go, take a moment to consider: have you ever experienced communication that seemed to come from someone who had passed away? Have you received information, comfort, or guidance that appeared to originate from beyond the normal boundaries of life and death? Thomas McKinnon's experience with the Phantom Telegraph Network reminds us that such experiences might be more common and more meaningful than skeptical attitudes typically acknowledge. Remember, Thomas's most valuable tool wasn't sophisticated technology or religious authority. It was his willingness to take seriously communications that others dismissed as impossible, and his courage to develop protective methods that honored both the reality of the phenomenon and the safety needs of living people. In our modern world, where technology creates new forms of communication that we don't fully understand, his example of careful investigation combined with practical spiritual protection remains as relevant as ever. Next week we'll explore another case where technological innovation created unexpected opportunities for contact between the living and the dead. Until then, remember that the most important communications often come through channels we don't expect, from sources we might not believe possible, and that staying open to these possibilities while maintaining appropriate spiritual protection might be one of the most important skills for navigating a world where the boundaries between life and death are more fluid than